Hello, hi, welcome once again to M5's English language learning program, Let's Speak English. I'm Gav Duncan and I'm here on your TV screen to help you learn English. And don't forget, you can also catch up with the other English lessons at www.m5tv.hu. So, if you missed any lessons, or if you'd like to watch some of the videos again, that's the place to point your mouse at. www.m5tv.hu. Also, on the website, you'll find vocabulary lists with the most important vocabulary from our lessons. www.m5tv.hu. Okay, back to today. Now, are you sitting comfortably? Yes? Good. And are you ready for today's lesson? Yes? Good. Okay, well, let's learn English together. Well now, hello there. How are you all today? Are you all feeling well? Good. Are you all rested and relaxed and ready for some more English numbers? You are? Fantastic. Now, you probably remember that last lesson we looked at some English numbers. You do remember, don't you? Okay, just checking. Okay, so last lesson we looked at numbers in the thousands, and we learnt that when we write 1,000, we have to put a comma after the 1 and before the 3 noughts, like this. Now, we have to do this for all numbers in the thousands. It's not something we only do with 1,000. The easiest way is to make sure we do it correctly by putting a comma before the 3 noughts. Simple. If the number is 14,000, we put a comma before the 3 noughts and everything's fine. Also, last lesson, we learnt that we have to put and before the number when we're dealing with numbers above 100. So, if we're talking about the number 14,212, then we know that we have to put a comma after the 14. And when we say the number, we have to say 14,212. Okay, now let's try something different. Let's try moving in the other direction. We've looked at large numbers. Now let's look at some smaller numbers. Let's look at some fractions. Let's look at numbers which are less than 1. Okay. Now, numbers which are less than 1 are called fractions. We can either use imperial fractions or we can use decimal fractions. They're the same. We just write them and say them differently. Sometimes we use imperial fractions when we talk about a half of something, and sometimes we use decimal fractions when we talk about 0.5 of something. They mean the same, we just write them and say them differently. Okay, now we know lots of different fractions. We use lots of different fractions every day. And the ones we use most are half, a third, 2/3, a quarter, and 3/4. Okay, these are the most common imperial fractions we use. Now, let's look at what the words actually mean. Let's see the logic. Well, the verb to half means to cut something into 2 equal parts, to make 2 halves. 2 halves make 1. So if we have a half of something, it's 50% of something. If we split something into thirds, then we need 3 of them to make 100%. So a third is 33.33333 recurring of something. To quarter something is to cut it into 4 pieces. So we need 4 to make 100%. This means that a quarter is 25% of something. We can use 2 verbs here, to halve, meaning to cut into 2 equal parts, and to quarter, meaning to cut into 4 equal parts. There is no verb to third. So, those are fractions, less than 1 of something. Now, we also know the decimal versions of those fractions. The decimal system is very simple. Everything is based on 10, so that makes it nice and simple. Now, what do you think the decimal version of half is? That's right, it's 0.5. Half equals 0.5. Simple. All right. When I said that, did you hear which word I used? Correct-a-doodle-doo. I said 0.5, didn't I? Now, if you remember our first lesson on numbers in English, you probably remember that we talked about different ways of saying O. When we say the number 0 in British English, we usually say naught. It's possible to also say 0. Most Americans say 0. If we say the number 0, 0, 0 in a series of numbers, when we tell someone a telephone number, for example, then we don't say 0 but O. If we're measuring something, then we say 0. Now, we also learned that in sports, the number 0, 0 changes. In most sports, the number 0 or 0 is nil. But in tennis and table tennis, the number 0, 0 is called love. Tottenham 5, Swansea City 0. West Bromwich Albion 3, Watford 1. West Ham United 1. Arsenal 5. Juan Martín del Potro beat Novak Djokovic 6-love. Okay, so we know that we can say the number 0, 0, 0 in different ways. But right now, at the moment, we're concentrating on decimal fractions. So let's get back to the fractions. When we say a decimal fraction, we have to make sure that we say each number separately. If we want to say 3/4 as a decimal fraction, we say 0.75. 0.75, not 0.75. Great. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a decimal fraction or not. The number or numbers that come after a decimal point are always said as separate figures. So, always remember, we use a decimal point to show that something is less than 1. And after a decimal point, we have to say each number separately. If we're talking about a decimal fraction, or if we're talking about numbers after a decimal point, we always say the numbers after a decimal point as separate numbers. It's 0.87634, 0.87634, not 0.87634. And we say 3.56 billion euros. 3.56 billion euros, not 3.56 billion euros. Now, what else do we need to be careful about? Well, we have to make sure that we use a full stop, not a comma, before the fraction. When we talk about thousands, we put a comma before the 3 noughts, or the last 3 digits. When we look at 33,546, or when we write 142,243, we separate the thousands from the rest of the number with a comma. But when we write a decimal fraction, we don't use a comma. With decimal fractions, we use a full stop to indicate that it's less than 1. When we write 0.5, we put a full stop between the 0 and the 5. When we write pi, we put a full stop, a point, between the 3 and the fraction of the number, and we say point. 0.5, pi equals 3.14159. Great. So let's see if these fractions are correct or incorrect. Okay, so which ones were correct and which ones were incorrect? Let's have a look, shall we? Half is 1/2 or a half, so that's correct. 1/3 is 1/3, not 2/3. 2/3 is 2/3, not a quarter. 1/4 is a quarter or 1/4. That's correct. 0.75 is incorrect. Why? Because we put a full stop when we write a decimal fraction. 0.75 is 0.75, which is also the same as 3/4. Now, what about the next one? 0.75 is 0.75, not 0.75. And the next? 0.75 is 0.75, 3/4, not 1/4 or a quarter. 3.25 is 3.25, not 3.25. So the last one is correct. Okay, now let's just think for a moment about somewhere else where we use some of these fractions. Well, we also use some of these fractions when we want to tell the time. When we talk about parts of an hour, we often talk about quarters and halves. Do you remember what we learned about telling the time? If the minute hand is between 12 and 6, it's past the hour. And if the minute hand is between 6 and 12, it's to the hour. We often split or divide the hour into 2 halves or 4 quarters. This way, we often use quarters and halves when we're talking about time. For example, we know that 5:15 is 5:15. 5:30 is 5:30, and 5:45 is 5:45. Do you remember the difference between English and Hungarian with half past? That's right. In Hungarian, we always say that it's halfway to the next hour. But in English, we always say that it's half past the previous hour. Okay, we know that we use quarters and halves when we're telling the time. But we also often use quarters and halves when we're talking about time periods as well. It's very common for someone to use fractions of an hour when they're talking. For instance, it takes me 3/4 of an hour to get to work. The bus was late. I waited for half an hour and then walked home. I get half an hour for my lunch break every day. You can walk to the train station. It'll take about 1/4 of an hour. And that's all we've got time for today. Our 1/4 of an hour is finished. So, I'll see you all tomorrow for another 1/4 of an hour of English fun. Another 0.25 hours worth of English. I'm Gav Duncan. I'm not Old Father Time, and I'm not Rip Van Winkle. I'm Gav Duncan, and we'll see each other tomorrow. Have fun until then. See you later. Bye.